Hello, everybody. We're back with another lecture here. And today we are going to continue where we left off with the last lecture, and we're going to talk about Richard Nixon. Now, all the sophomores out there, you all have your packet of notes, and we're not necessarily going to follow the notes line for line, but I'm just going to try to tell you a little bit about Nixon very briefly to help you understand the assignments and the notes that go with it. Or for anybody else out there that wants to know a little bit more about Richard Milhouse Nixon. Well, if you recall, Richard Nixon had come to Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of World War II as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He goes on to the Senate. And then, of course, he is a two-term vice president for Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower and Nixon had a very interesting relationship. They weren't the best of friends. As a matter of fact, when Nixon became the Republican Party's nominee in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, offhandedly in a press conference, someone asked President Eisenhower, they said, why should Richard Nixon win in 1960? What has he done in your administration that would help, convince people that he should be in charge of the executive branch? And Eisenhower went, well, you know what? If you give me a week or two, I could think of something that he's done. And it was a very devastating comment to Richard Nixon, who Eisenhower had kicked around the idea of even removing Nixon as vice president for his second term and putting him in charge of the Defense Department or something like that. So it's a very strange relationship, but interestingly enough, Eisenhower's grandson will go on to marry Richard Nixon's daughter. So as we talked the other day, Nixon has this great political comeback in 1968. He had lost the presidency in 60, as we just mentioned. He had been beaten for the governor of California in 1962, but in 68, Nixon wins the presidency. He squeaks out a narrow victory. And what we're going to briefly talk about today is the overall picture of Richard Nixon, who he was, what he was about, and why we should remember him. Now, most people already know. We remember Nixon negatively in American history for his participation in the Watergate burglary cover-up. But Nixon accomplished some good things. While Nixon was president, Richard Nixon, he has the Soviet Union, the Cold War is raging, but Nixon and the Soviet Union sign a treaty known as SALT I, and that is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limits, just briefly kind of condensing it, it limits the amount of atomic weapons that both countries can have. Not only that, maybe his greatest accomplishment, Nixon in 1972 travels to China, basically opening up a relationship with the communist country of China that had been closed to the United States of America since the communist takeover in 1949. So Nixon goes to China, which removes China as an immediate Cold War danger. It makes the Soviet Union jealous. They come to the table, and Nixon is able to accomplish what is known as détente, an easing of tensions with the Soviet Union. But not only that, in 1973, Nixon gets America out of the Vietnam War with what he called peace with honor. In peace with honor, basically, the Paris Peace Accords, this agreement between the United States of America and the North Vietnamese, ends the American involvement in the Vietnam War. It pulls America out of the Vietnam War. And we can talk about the success or failure of that in a later lecture. But Nixon is doing what he promised to do, and that is to get Americans out of the war. But there's a negative side, and I know we're squishing all this together. For Nixon to pull troops out of Vietnam, he had to cover that withdrawal with increased air raids. And some of that spread over into the neighboring countries of Vietnam of Cambodia and Laos. Well, as news gets out that Nixon was spreading the war early on in his first term in 1970, massive anti-war protests break out around the country. And the most tragic of those would take place at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4th, 1970. A bunch of student protesters against the spreading of the war had gathered, and in the crowd, it doesn't excuse what happens later, but the crowd was getting a little violent, and the National Guard was called in. And through the chaos of the National Guard being brought in to restore order at Kent State University, through the confusion, the National Guard fired into a crowd of unarmed students, killing 4 Kent State University protesters. Now, obviously, there is no excuse for the government to ever fire upon unarmed people. But this only brings home how devastating the Vietnam War time period actually was. This became known as the day the war came home. So early on in Nixon's first term, we have this Kent State Massacre, this terrible event. But as we get to Nixon's reelection, he's doing some good things in Vietnam by 72. He's opened up China by 72. He's signing treaties with the Soviet Union, making the world a safer place by 1972. So going into the 1972 election, Richard Nixon is poised for a massive victory. And it's going to become, well, a tragic story for Richard Nixon. And we're going to pick up with that in another lecture that will just focus upon Watergate.